There was a cedar box in the basement of a county courthouse on the Georgia coast that nobody opened for almost 100 years. Not because it was lost, because every clerk who handled it had been told the same thing. Do not break the red wax. Do not cut the black thread. Do not read the papers inside unless a judge orders it. The box was small enough to carry under one arm. Its lid had swollen from salt air. Its corners were dark with mildew. On the top, in a shaking hand, someone had written one sentence: "If the river has not forgotten, neither should we." In 1969, a graduate researcher named Helen Merrow was cataloging old probate records when she found the box behind a cabinet of tax rolls. The red wax had cracked by then. The black thread had rotted thin as hair. Inside was a field ledger, a doctor's notebook, 3 burnt scraps of plantation accounts, and 26 pages of testimony from a formerly enslaved woman named Mara Bell. What those pages described was not a ghost story. It was not folklore. It was not one of those clean plantation tragedies that can be softened into sorrow and left there. It was a system built on tidal mud, debt, law, and a woman who believed the human body could be turned into a schedule. The plantation was called Blackwater Reach. It sat near the lower Altamaha River, where the marsh smelled of salt and rot, and the rice trunks clicked at night when the tide pushed against them. The woman who owned it was Adelaide Vale. What she built there did not begin with madness. That would be easier to understand. It began with arithmetic. Columns of debt. Columns of age. Columns of expected labor. Columns where children were valued before they were even born. And that is what made Blackwater Reach so dangerous. Adelaide Vale did not think of herself as cruel. She thought of herself as disciplined. She called it management. She called it order. She called it the only way to save the estate. The people forced to live under her called it something else. They called it the counting house. Because at Blackwater Reach, the ink tried to own everything. Names, WOMs, children, memory. But ink has one weakness. It burns. And when Adelaide Vale began burning the records, she learned too late that the people she had counted had already begun counting her. The story begins in January of 1841, when Adelaide's husband Thomas Vale died with a pistol in his desk and more debt than cotton in his fields. Thomas had inherited Blackwater Reach from his father, who had made money shipping rice downriver before cotton became the louder dream. By the 1830s, the plantation covered nearly 5,000 acres of marsh, pine, and worked fields. On paper, it looked wealthy, but paper was where Blackwater Reach lied best. Thomas had borrowed against the next harvest, then the harvest after that, then the people he enslaved, then the land itself. He had gambled on cotton prices, lost money in a failed steam mill, and bought 23 people on credit from a trader in Savannah. When he died of fever, Adelaide was 37 years old, with 3 living children, a leaking roof, and creditors who came wearing black coats and polite smiles. The largest note was due in 3 years. If she failed to pay it, Blackwater Reach would be sold in pieces. The land, the house, the livestock, the tools, and every enslaved person on the inventory. Adelaide listened to the lawyers in the front parlor while rain beat against the windows. They told her what widows were usually told. Hire a stronger overseer, sell a few hands, reduce household expenses, ask a male cousin to advise her. She thanked them. Then she shut the parlor doors and read the plantation ledgers alone. She read them for 3 nights. By the 4th morning she had found the line that would ruin everyone. The plantation had 58 enslaved people of working age, 21 children, and 9 women Adelaide marked as increase capable. That was the phrase Thomas had used in his own neat handwriting. Increase capable. Not mothers, not daughters, not women. Increase capable. Adelaide circled the phrase so hard the pen cut through the page. She understood something her husband had been too careless to use fully. In the law's cold language, enslaved children followed the condition of the mother. Every child born to an enslaved woman belonged to the owner. A child was not a person under that system. A child was future capital. And Adelaide Vale needed capital. At first, she told herself she was merely organizing what already happened on plantations. White men forced themselves on enslaved women everywhere, and called the children property. Traders spoke openly of natural increase. Planters counted infants in appraisals. Courts protected the ownership claims. Adelaide did not invent the evil. She refined it. She turned violation into a program. She drew a private chart of the women between 16 and 26. She noted their health, their mothers, their previous pregnancies, their strength in the fields, even the color of their skin, as if mixing human inheritance were no different from selecting seed. Then she looked at her sons. Edward Vale was 19, narrow-faced and obedient, raised to believe duty was the highest form of goodness. Charles was 17, handsome in a careless way, quick to laugh and quicker to strike. Their sister Anna was 12 and still young enough to think silence in a house meant peace. Adelaide did not approach both sons at once. She began with Edward. She called him into Thomas's study, where the walls still smelled of tobacco and damp leather. On the desk she had placed the debt papers in one stack and the plantation inventory in another. "Your father left us exposed," she said. Edward looked at the notes, confused by the scale of the numbers. Adelaide let him study them until fear did the work she needed. Then she opened the field ledger to the page she had marked. "We cannot purchase more hands," she said. "We cannot sell enough cotton fast enough. We must grow value from what we already hold." Edward's face changed before he spoke. He understood. "No." That was all he said at first. Adelaide folded her hands. "You are a son of this house." "No," he said again, but weaker. She told him the creditors would take Blackwater Reach. She told him his sister would become dependent on relatives who already despised them. She told him their father's name would become a warning whispered at church doors. She told him survival required sacrifice. What she did not tell him was that the sacrifice would not be his, not truly. By the end of the conversation, Edward was crying. By the end of the week, he had stopped refusing. Charles did not cry. When Adelaide explained the plan to him, he leaned back in his chair and asked only whether the overseer would know. That should have frightened her. Instead, it relieved her. Within 2 months, Adelaide had moved 12 enslaved women into a long, low building behind the smokehouse. She called it the North Quarters. Nobody else did. The people at Blackwater Reach called it the counting house. It had 2 rooms, 4 narrow beds, a locked cabinet of medicines, and a slate board where Adelaide wrote initials and dates. Women were given more cornmeal while pregnant, molasses when they were weak, and lighter tasks only when it protected the child Adelaide expected to claim. These were not mercies. They were maintenance. A woman named Mara Bell worked in the kitchen of the big house. She was 31, dark-skinned, broad-shouldered, and known among the enslaved people for remembering everything. She remembered births. She remembered sales. She remembered which child belonged to which mother after the traders tried to scatter them. She remembered because nobody could take a memory at auction unless the person carrying it died. Mara had no paper, no pencil, no book, so she made a book inside herself. She gave each year a marker. The year the East rice trunk broke, the year the fever took 3 babies, the year Edward stopped looking anyone in the eye, the year the counting house began. Mara watched the women moved behind the smokehouse. She watched Edward cross the yard at night with his shoulders bent like an old man. She watched Charles walk the same path with no shame at all. She listened when Adelaide spoke in the kitchen as if the black women serving her were furniture. 2 pregnancies by summer, Adelaide told the overseer one morning. 4 by Christmas if the schedule holds. The overseer laughed nervously. Mara did not move. Her hand stayed in the biscuit dough, but inside her she made a line. 2 by summer. 4 by Christmas. That was how the testimony began, not on paper, in a woman's mind. By late 1842, Adelaide's system was working exactly as she intended. 3 women were pregnant by Edward, 2 by Charles, 1 by both, though Adelaide destroyed the line in the ledger that made the sequence clear. She weighed children at birth. She assigned projected values by age 10. She wrote comments beside infants as if reviewing livestock. Strong cry. Pale eyes. Good limbs. Mother recovers slowly. The handwriting was careful, almost beautiful. That is what made the ledger so unbearable to read. It did not look like rage. It did not look like a crime scene. It looked like a competent woman doing accounts. And every column made the same argument. If the law calls people property, then cruelty can dress itself as bookkeeping. The women in the counting house learned Adelaide's rhythms. They learned when she checked the slate. They learned which midwife questions meant danger. They learned that refusal did not end the violation. It only changed who else would be punished. One woman, Sella, tried to hide her bleeding and nearly died of fever. Another, Rose, bit Charles badly enough to leave a scar between his thumb and wrist. Adelaide had Rose's mother sent to the Far Ditch cruise for 6 weeks, then brought her back so Rose could see what resistance cost. A third woman, Junie, stopped speaking altogether. Adelaide wrote beside Junie's name, "Temper difficult, but sound stock." Mara heard that phrase from the pantry and carried it like a coal in her mouth for 24 years. Sound stock. In 1843, the program widened. Adelaide added 6 more women to the counting house. She began pairing enslaved men and women when she believed her sons were not enough to maintain the rate she wanted. She separated husbands from wives. She punished attachments. She studied family lines with the intensity of a breeder, pretending the carefulness of the method made it less obscene. Neighbors began to notice. They noticed the light-skinned children in the yard. They noticed that Blackwater Reach's appraised value was rising while other plantations struggled. They noticed Adelaide paying down Thomas's debts ahead of schedule. At church suppers, white women called her formidable. Men called her practical. One planter from McIntosh County asked quietly whether she had found a reliable method for increase. Adelaide smiled and said discipline was the mother of prosperity. Nobody asked what discipline meant, because asking would require knowing, and knowing would require choosing. Most people prefer admiration to responsibility. The first open refusal came from a man named Gideon Ash. Gideon was the plantation cooper. He made barrels, repaired rice trunks, patched wagons, and understood wood the way some men understood scripture. He had been brought to Blackwater Reach as a boy and had survived by becoming too useful to sell casually. His daughter Liza was 15. Adelaide marked her name in the private ledger in March of 1844. Beside it she wrote, "Next season." Mara saw the mark because Adelaide left the ledger open while calling for tea. Mara could not read every word, but she knew names. She knew numbers. She knew the slash Adelaide used when a woman was moved from field labor into the counting house. That night, Mara told Gideon, she found him behind the cooper shed, shaving a barrel stave by firelight. At first he said nothing. Then he set down the knife. "Did she write my child?" Mara nodded. Gideon covered his face with both hands. There are moments when grief is loud. This was not one of them. This grief went silent because it had found the bottom. For 3 days Gideon kept working. He repaired casks, he mended a cartwheel, he answered the overseer in the same lowered voice. Then, on a warm morning when the marsh gnats lifted in clouds from the drainage ditch, the overseer came for Liza. Gideon stepped between them. "No," he said. The overseer, a red-haired man named Enoch Price, blinked as if the word had come from an animal. "What did you say?" Gideon picked up a draw knife from the bench. "I said no." Every sound in the yard seemed to retreat. The hammering stopped. The mule stopped braying. Even the insects seemed to pull back from what was about to happen. Gideon did not raise the knife. He did not threaten. He simply stood between his daughter and the path to the smokehouse. Price reached for his whip. Gideon looked at him and said, "You can kill me here, but you will have to step over me first." That sentence spread through Blackwater Reach faster than weather. By noon, Adelaide had heard it. By sunset, she had decided what punishment would teach the lesson most efficiently. She did not beat Gideon. She did not sell him. Gideon was too valuable. Instead, Adelaide used the only instrument sharper than pain. She used love. The next morning, every enslaved person on Blackwater Reach was forced into the yard between the house and the quarters. Liza stood on the porch steps, shaking so badly Mara thought she might fall. Gideon was brought out with rope around his wrists. Beside Adelaide stood Edward, white as milk, holding a folded paper. Charles stood near the overseer, smiling at nothing. Adelaide told the crowd that Gideon had refused a lawful order. She told them disobedience threatened the order of every life on the place. Then she nodded to Edward. Edward unfolded the paper. His voice broke twice before the end. Liza, daughter of Gideon Ash, was to be sold to a trader bound for Louisiana. Not next month. Not after harvest. That day. A wagon waited by the gate. Mara heard Liza's mother make a sound that did not seem human. She heard Gideon breathe once, hard, as if something inside him had been torn loose. Adelaide let the crowd see the wagon. Then she offered mercy. If Gideon apologized on his knees, if he acknowledged his wrong, if he promised to guide his daughter into obedience, then Adelaide would cancel the sale. No one in that yard mistook it for mercy. She was forcing a father to choose the shape of his daughter's suffering. Louisiana meant cane fields, fever, distance, almost certain death. Blackwater Reach meant the counting house. It meant survival inside a system designed to break the meaning of survival. Gideon looked at Liza. Liza looked at the wagon. Then Gideon knelt. He said the words Adelaide required, every one of them, and when he finished, the plantation was quieter than it had ever been. Adelaide canceled the sale. Liza remained at Blackwater Reach. That night she was taken to the counting house. That was the day Mara stopped merely remembering. That was the day she began organizing memory like a weapon. She repeated the names to herself while washing pans. Gideon, Liza, Edward holding the paper, Charles smiling, Adelaide in the porch shade, the wagon, the rope, the kneeling. If paper could be used to threaten a child, then memory would be used to accuse the paper. Mara was not the only witness. In the spring of 1845, a doctor named Silas Ward began visiting Blackwater Reach more often than before. Ward was from Philadelphia originally, though he had lived in Georgia long enough to call himself practical. He told himself he did not own anyone. He told himself treating the sick was better than leaving them untreated. He told himself a man could work inside a rotten system without becoming rotten himself. Blackwater Reach took those excuses away. Ward delivered babies in the counting house. He treated bruises he was not allowed to name. He saw Adelaide's slate. He saw dates matched to women's cycles. He saw Edward waiting outside the smokehouse with his hands shaking. He saw Charles leave with blood on his sleeve. The first time Adelaide showed him her private ledger, she did it with pride. "You see the principle," she said. "Unplanned increase is wasteful. Planned increase is stability." Ward stared at the page. There were children listed before they were born, not by name, by expected value. He later wrote that this was the first moment he understood the true horror of Blackwater Reach, not because slavery elsewhere was gentle. It was not. But because Adelaide had stripped even the usual lies away. No paternal fiction. No household myth. No talk of care. Just the naked belief that ownership gave the right to design another person's future from the inside of her body outward. That night, Ward sat in the room above the kitchen and opened a small notebook. On the first page, he wrote, "I have helped keep alive what should have been exposed. May these notes outlive my cowardice." He wrote about the counting house. He wrote about Adelaide's ledger. He wrote about Edward and Charles. He wrote about Liza. He wrote about the children whose faces were already making denial impossible. He did not act. That is important. He wrote, but he did not act. He documented evil and still returned when Adelaide summoned him. He told himself testimony mattered. He told himself one day the truth would need proof. Mara did not forgive him for that. But she used him. One evening, while he treated a burn on her forearm, Mara looked at the notebook in his coat pocket. "You write the names?" she asked. Ward froze. Mara kept her voice low. "You write all of them, or only what makes you feel clean?" The question hit harder than accusation. Ward could not answer. Mara leaned closer. "If you write, write true. Not just what she did. Write who we are. Write mothers with names. Write fathers with names. Write the children they tried to turn into numbers." Ward nodded. Mara did not smile. "Paper lies when cowards hold the pen," she said. "Do not make me remember against you too." After that, Ward's notes changed. They became less clinical. He began recording names as Mara gave them to him. Sella, Rose, Junie, Liza, Nan, Ruthie, Esther, Belle. He recorded which children were taken from which mothers. He recorded the punishments Adelaide designed to make relatives police one another. He recorded his own failure with a brutality he had not used before. By 1846, Adelaide had paid the largest debt. Blackwater Reach should have felt safer. Instead, it had become more unstable. Edward was collapsing. He drank before breakfast. He avoided the counting house when he could. He rode to the marsh edge and sat for hours watching the tide crawl through the reeds. At meals, he spoke only when Adelaide forced him. One night, Anna found him in the old laundry room with a pistol on the table. He had not fired it. He had not even loaded it. He was just staring at it, as if trying to decide whether guilt had a door. Anna told Adelaide. Adelaide hid the pistols and told the house staff never to mention it. Charles went the other way. He became louder, meaner, more pleased with the power Adelaide had trained into him. At first he followed schedules because they made him important. Later, he ignored them because nothing inside the system told him he could not. He struck men in the field for looking at him. He cornered women outside the counting house. He gambled with traders in Darien and bragged in ways that made even other white men uncomfortable. Adelaide tried to restrain him, not because he was hurting people, because he was damaging the machinery. That was how she thought of it. Machinery. But the people she called machinery were listening. Gideon had not recovered from the morning he knelt, but something in him had hardened after breaking. He began meeting Mara behind the old rice mill after midnight. Sella came. Rose came. A stable hand named Abram came. An older ditch worker named Moses came, carrying knowledge of every gate, culvert, trunk, and tide channel on the plantation. They could not fight Blackwater Reach like an army. They had no guns, they had children, they had old people, they had no safe road out, but they had hands, they had timing. They had knowledge of the place Adelaide pretended to command. Moses knew which rice trunks could be jammed without flooding the slave quarters. Abram knew which horses could be turned loose without being lost. Selah knew Adelaide's cycle charts well enough to corrupt them. Mara knew where the private ledger was kept. Gideon knew what wood would fail under strain and still look sound until the moment it mattered. Their resistance began so small that Adelaide mistook it for inconvenience. A gate jammed. A wheel cracked. A medicine bottle went missing. A slate was wiped clean. A line in the ledger blurred when water spilled across it. A woman reported the wrong date. Another reported illness at the exact time Adelaide expected compliance. 3 pregnancies Adelaide had counted on did not happen. 1 child survived because the mother was hidden in the far wash house through a dangerous fever, instead of being taken where Adelaide could record and control the birth. Blackwater Reach began to miscount itself, and a plantation built on counting could not tolerate uncertainty. Adelaide grew harsher. She hired 2 new overseers from Savannah, men with dead eyes and cheap boots. Men willing to use violence without asking what had caused the need for it. For a few weeks, fear returned to the yard. Then the west rice trunk failed at high tide. Salt water poured into the wrong channel and ruined an entire section of young crop. Adelaide screamed at Moses for neglect. Moses bowed his head, but later, in the dark, he told Mara the truth. The pin had been shaved almost through. Not enough to see. Enough to break when the tide pulled hard. After that, the smokehouse roof leaked directly onto stored bacon. A wagon axle split on the road to town. The north quarter lock jammed so badly Charles had to kick the door until his own foot swelled. Each event could be explained. Together they formed a sentence. The plantation is not yours alone. Adelaide understood the sentence before she admitted it. Her answer was terror. She ordered 3 men whipped. She sent 2 women to the far ditch crews. She threatened to sell Abram south. Then Charles nearly killed a woman named Nan. He beat her after she laughed at him. Not publicly, not loudly. Just one quick sound through her nose when he slipped in the mud outside the counting house. He heard it. That was enough. Ward was called before dawn. Nan was losing blood. She was pregnant. The child did not survive. For 2 days, Ward thought Nan would not survive either. When Ward confronted Adelaide, his voice shook so hard he could barely speak. "Your son is not disciplining anyone," he said. "He is destroying them." Adelaide looked at him as if he had used the wrong unit of measurement. "The child can be replaced," she said. Ward wrote that sentence in his notebook 3 times. "The child can be replaced. The child can be replaced. The child can be replaced." Then he closed the notebook and refused to return to Blackwater Reach. Adelaide laughed at first. She thought doctors were replaceable too. But pregnancy without medical help brought losses she had not calculated. Infants died. Women developed fevers. Adelaide's careful system, already damaged by sabotage, began producing less and costing more. Then Edward disappeared. In September of 1846, he rode to Darien and did not come back. For 3 days, Adelaide sent men along the roads, the river landing, the taverns. On the 4th day, a letter arrived. It was written in Edward's trembling hand. "Mother, I cannot continue. I cannot pray. I cannot eat. I cannot stand in that yard and see my own face in children I was made to help create. Keep the house, keep the land, keep the name. I leave you the inheritance you chose. There was no signature. Adelaide read the letter once. Then she burned it in the dining room fireplace. Mara saw the ash. Anna saw Adelaide's hand shaking. Charles saw an opportunity. With Edward gone, he became the only son left at Blackwater Reach. Adelaide needed him. That made him bold. He demanded money. He demanded a horse. He demanded control over the men in the field. He mocked Adelaide for creating a system she could no longer command. "You taught me what they were," he said one night, drunk in the hall. "Now you don't like that I believed you." That was the first time Adelaide struck him. Charles laughed. The house had begun eating its own children. By winter, the counting house no longer worked as a program. Women were hiding, lying, bleeding, resisting, warning one another. The records were unreliable. Charles was dangerous. Edward was gone. Ward would not come. The new overseers were hated and afraid. Adelaide had built a system that required total control. But slavery, for all its violence, never had total control. It only pretended to. On the coldest night of February 1847, the counting house burned. No one died. That mattered to Mara. The women inside had been warned. A loose board at the back had been pulled free. When smoke filled the room, they crawled out through the opening and ran into the ditch reeds. The building itself burned bright enough to redden the underside of the clouds. Adelaide stood in the yard wearing only a shawl over her nightdress, watching 6 years of calculation turn to sparks. Charles shouted for buckets. Gideon carried water slowly. Too slowly. Everyone carried water slowly. The next morning, Adelaide ordered the ashes sifted for proof. She found none. She ordered the building rebuilt. 3 weeks later, the frame caught fire before the roof was even finished. This time, she posted guards. After that, no building burned. But the program was dead. Everyone knew it before Adelaide announced it. She waited until April. She gathered the house staff and the overseers, and declared that the north quarters would not be restored. Women would return to ordinary labor assignments. The plantation would continue under stricter management. She spoke as if she had chosen efficiency. But the people at Blackwater Reach knew surrender when they heard it. They had not won freedom. They had not ended slavery. They had not received justice. But they had destroyed the counting house. And sometimes survival begins with breaking one machine before it can swallow the next child. Mara marked the year inside herself. The year the counting house burned. After that, Adelaide's power narrowed. Blackwater Reach still produced cotton and rice, but never with the smooth terror Adelaide had wanted. The debt was mostly paid, but the estate's reputation had soured. Neighbors whispered. Traders recognized too many pale children. Overseers came and left. No decent doctor stayed long. Edward was found dead in a boarding room in 1849, 27 years old, his body ruined by drink and laudanum. In his trunk, Anna found 6 pages of confession addressed to no one. Adelaide took them from her. Anna watched her mother read the first page. Then Adelaide burned all 6. But Anna had read enough to understand. She was 17 by then, old enough to know silence was not innocence. Charles lasted longer. In 1851, after killing an enslaved man during a drunken beating, he was sent west to relatives in Texas before county gossip hardened into legal trouble. He died there 3 years later, shot outside a gambling room over a debt he refused to pay. Adelaide did not mourn in public. By then, public feeling had become another ledger she could not balance. In 1854, she suffered a stroke that twisted her mouth and left her right side weak. Anna, married and living in Savannah, returned to Blackwater Reach to manage the house long enough to sell it. That was when she found what remained, not the full ledger. Adelaide had already destroyed much of it, but enough. Loose pages and a locked desk, children listed by number, women grouped by age, private notes in the margin, Edward, Charles, expected return. Anna sat on the floor of her father's old study and read until the candle burned low. By morning she had made the mistake many frightened descendants make. She confused destroying evidence with ending shame. She burned the pages in the kitchen stove. Mara stood near the wash table and watched the last written proof turn black. Anna told herself she was protecting the children. Mara knew better. The papers had never protected anyone, but they could have accused. That night, Mara gathered those who still carried the memory: Gideon, Sella, Rose, Moses, Nan, who had survived, Liza, who had a child by then and eyes older than her mother's. Mara told them the written records were gone. Then she began speaking. She named every woman taken to the counting house. She named every child she could match to a mother. She named punishments. She named the fires. She named the day Gideon knelt. She named the sentence Adelaide had said about Nan's child. The child can be replaced. Everyone repeated it, not because they believed it, because it had to be remembered as a crime. Mara made them promise. Tell it clean. Tell it with names. Tell it when the children are old enough. Tell it even if it makes the room go quiet. Tell it because they burned the paper. Adelaide died in 1857. Her funeral was small. Anna came veiled and left before supper. No grand sermon was printed. No neighboring planters praised her management. Blackwater Reach was sold the next year below its appraised value to a merchant who wanted land and did not ask why the price was low. The house survived the Civil War. The plantation system did not. When freedom came in 1865, the people of Blackwater Reach left in different directions. Some stayed nearby because leaving required money they did not have. Some followed soldiers' roads inland. Some searched for family sold years before. Some changed their names. Some held on to the old names because survival had already stolen enough. Mara was 55. She had carried the book inside herself for more than 20 years. In 1866, she gave testimony to an agent working with the Freedmen's Bureau near Brunswick. The man expected complaints about wages, contracts, violence, and stolen children. Mara gave him those. Then she gave him Blackwater Reach. For 2 days she spoke. She did not rush. She corrected him when he spelled names wrong. She made him write woman where he had written female. She made him write child where he had written increase. She gave dates by flood, by fever, by harvest, by the year the counting house burned. At one point the agent asked how she could remember so much. Mara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Because they counted us wrong." That sentence was copied into the report. The report was folded, filed, moved, misfiled, and nearly lost. Silas Ward's notebook survived another way. After leaving Blackwater Reach, Ward returned north and practiced medicine in small towns where no one asked too closely about Georgia. He never published his notes. He never testified. He lived long enough to know slavery had ended and not long enough to believe the country had understood what it had done. When he died, his papers went to a cousin. The cousin's daughter married a county judge in Georgia, and somehow, through inheritance, avoidance, and the strange accidents by which truth survives, Ward's notebook was placed in the cedar box with Mara's testimony and the burnt fragments Anna had failed to destroy completely. Someone sealed it. Someone wrote on the lid, "If the river has not forgotten, neither should we." Then the box waited. It waited through Reconstruction. It waited through Jim Crow. It waited through school children being taught that plantations were graceful houses with sad endings and loyal servants. It waited while descendants carried stories they were told not to bring up at white counters, in courthouse halls, in classrooms where their history was treated as accusation. The box waited because paper is patient, but memory was more patient. When Helen Marrow opened it in 1969, she did not discover a story from nowhere. She found the written edge of a story black families in the county had been carrying for generations. That is why the box mattered. Not because a doctor finally made the suffering real. Mara had already made it real. Gideon had made it real. Liza had made it real. Sella, Rose, Nan, Moses, Abram, and all the children Adelaide tried to reduce to future value had made it real by living, remembering, and telling. The box mattered because it showed how hard the truth had worked to remain findable. Blackwater Reach is not marked today. The main house is gone. The marsh has swallowed the old ditch lines in places. Pine trees grow where quarters once stood. When the tide comes in, water still moves through the low ground with the same slow force it had in Adelaide Vale's time. There is no sign telling drivers to stop, no bronze plaque, no neat paragraph that makes the horror manageable. Maybe that absence is part of the lesson. Systems like the one Adelaide built do not vanish simply because buildings fall down. They survive in language, in records, in property, in family silences, in the habit of calling a human being a cost, a unit, a problem, an asset, a loss. Adelaide thought the ledger gave her power because it allowed her to name people as numbers. Mara understood something deeper. A number can be erased. A name can be carried. That is why Mara won more than Adelaide ever understood. Not completely. Not cleanly. Not in a way that returned what was stolen. But in the only way history sometimes allows the powerless to win against those who write the papers. She made sure the papers were not the last word. The ink failed. The names stayed.